Last night I was able to watch my brothers in Christ really confound a Hebrew Israelite who was maintaining salvation as only to Israel. And this was done in Romans chapter 15 and Ephesians chapter 3. And what they kept doing is they kept trying to deflect and run to Romans chapter 9, starting at verse 24. Now, I've covered this before, but we're going to break it down again, and we're going to go through all the little details so that when you as Christians are confronted with this particular passage, you know how to give an answer that they can't address. So let's get into it. Let's start with the argument itself that they present. Romans 9:24, even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. So this is dealing with Jews and Gentiles, and the question becomes, well, who are the Gentiles? As he says also in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. So the argument will be that Paul here quotes from Hosea. And as we go into the text of Hosea, the original context there is dealing with the northern kingdom of Israel. So then, it is said that when Paul refers to the Gentiles and applies these texts to the Gentiles, he's saying that the Gentiles are the northern kingdom Israelites who are in a Gentile state of mind or in idolatry or whatever the case may be. And they will argue typically, in fact, the only argument I've heard is that Paul here quotes from Hosea 1:10. But that's only partially true. You see, in verse 25, he quotes Hosea 2:23. In verse 26, he quotes Hosea 1:10. And they, because they have not studied the text, they've simply been taught this argument, aren't aware of this. But let's go and look in Hosea 2:23. And we're going to see, by starting a little bit earlier in the text, an issue that Hebrew Israelites are going to run into. We start in Hosea 2:18. In that day I will cut a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will break the bow, the sword, and war from the land. And I will make them lie down in security. And I will betroth you to me forever. Indeed, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know Yahweh. And it will be in that day that I will answer, declares Yahweh. I will answer the heavens, and they will answer the earth. And the earth will answer the grain, the new wine, and the oil. And they will answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land. I will have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. So as we review this prophecy, one of the things we find is that it is yet a future prophecy. God has not yet accomplished what he says he will do, leading up to what it says in verse 23. Notice again in verse 18, it says, I will break the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make them lie down in security. That has not yet happened. So given that this is a future prophecy, how is Paul applying it to the circumstances in his day? Remember, Paul is making application of this to people who are coming to faith in Christ. It is not about restoration to the land, which was not taking place in his day as an eschatological fulfillment. So what is he doing? Well, there are two possibilities. One, he's saying that this is an initial fulfillment. And the initial fulfillment of them being his people, God's people, would be seen much like how Joel 2:28 is fulfilled initially in Acts chapter 2, though not completely, with an end times eschatological fulfillment. That's possible. The other option is a typological fulfillment. Well, what is typology? Let's take a look. Looking here in the Pocket Dictionary of Theological Terms, it says typology, differing from a symbol or an allegory, a typology is a representation of an actual historical reference. According to Christian exegesis, biblical typology deals with the parallels between actual historical figures or events in salvation history and their later analogous fulfillment. So if this was a typology, Paul would be taking these events that deal with a physical reality, a physical restoration that takes place in the end times, and applying them as a typology to salvation in Christ that people were then experiencing. So those are our two options. Those are our two frameworks within which we have to understand what Paul is doing here. So let's continue in the text and see which one he's actually using. Is it that initial fulfillment, or is it typology? Going back to Romans 9, we're in verse 26, and now this is that quotation of Hosea 1:10. Let's look at it. Beginning in Hosea 1:8. Then she weaned Lo-Ruhamah, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And Yahweh said, Name him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And it will be that in the place where it is said of them, You are not my people, it will be said of them, You are the sons of the living God. This passage is rather ambiguous. There's no specific time frame that's established here, so we're going to continue in the text, and we'll put this on hold as it pertains to this particular text as to whether this is an initial fulfillment, a typological fulfillment, or a literal fulfillment as we continue. Now in Romans 9:27, the next verse we come to, it says, And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, Though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word on the land thoroughly and quickly. This is a quotation of Isaiah chapter 10, 22 and 23. Now it will be in that day that the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them, but will truly rely on Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant within them will return. A destructive end is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. For a complete destruction, one that is decreed, Lord Yahweh of hosts will do in the midst of the whole land. In this passage, God is dealing with the Assyrian exile that was going to take place, the destruction that was going to come upon the northern kingdom, and what was going to happen to the people in that they would be destroyed and only a remnant would return. Whereas in this particular text, the end that is decreed is the destruction that is to come from Syria. Paul, taking the language from the Septuagint and collapsing it down, adapts it and allows it to be used for God bringing about the restoration of a remnant under Christ. And so he's making a very different application than the original one. And so this cannot be an initial fulfillment here. It has to be a typological one, because God bringing about an end here is destructive, because that is what's being foretold, but bringing about an end in Romans chapter 9, it is with righteousness bringing about a restoration. Now back in Romans chapter 9, we get to verse 29. Here we have a quotation from Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1 starts with the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So we're dealing with that and a destruction that is coming upon them. Notice in verse 7, Your land is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, your fields, strangers are devouring them in your presence. It is desolate as overthrown by strangers. We're dealing here with the Babylonian destruction that took place hundreds of years prior to the life of Paul. So when we get to verse 9, unless Yahweh of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom. We would be like Gomorrah. So Paul is taking this language that refers to the destruction of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom, and how they only had a few survivors, and he is applying it to his day, to those who are coming to salvation in Christ. Remember in verse 24, even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. So here it's dealing with the calling, and Paul is borrowing this language, using it typologically of the remnant that survived Babylon, and applying it to the remnant that is coming to Christ in faith, which he also refers to in chapter 11. Romans 11:4. But what does the divine response say to him? I have left for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In this way, then, at the present time, a remnant according to God's gracious choice has also come to be. So whereas Isaiah dealt with Judah in a literal situation where God had preserved a remnant from the Babylonian destruction, this is something that took place in Isaiah's day. Paul is taking this language and applying it typologically to the remnant that has come to Christ in faith and thus received life in Christ, who has thus survived in Christ, making a different application a typological one. So as we track what's happening, first Hosea 2:23 is quoted. That is a future prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled. Hosea 1:10 was quoted, and that's a bit ambiguous. Then we have Isaiah chapter 10, 22 and 23, referring to the survivors of the Assyrian captivity, and Paul applying that to the remnant who receives life in Christ in his day. And then we have the destruction by Babylon in Isaiah chapter 1, and there are the survivors of that destruction, and Paul is applying it to his day where there are people surviving by coming to Christ. The quotations in 27 through 29, the first one refers to the northern kingdom, the second one refers to the southern kingdom, and yet they are brought together jointly as Israel. So if we are taking this as a literal application, Hebrew Israelites are going to have an issue, because verse 27 is a quotation about the northern kingdom, and they are Israel. And then 29 is a quotation about the southern kingdom, but they're that same Israel. The text is treating them as a unified nation, as a unified people, even though they are still scattered. So knowing then that the two kingdoms are treated together as just Israel, let's continue in the text of Romans 9 and see what happens. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness laid hold of righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not attain that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written. So here, Israel entered into the covenant agreement with God. That was the entire nation, all 12 tribes who did this. And so they pursued a law of righteousness, but they did not obtain it because they continued to be disobedient to that law, and they ultimately turned far away from it, moving all the way into idolatry. And why was that? Because they did not pursue it by faith. They weren't rooted in faith in their pursuit of the law. They were rooted in the works of the law, and so they kept turning away from God, turning into idolatry. So we know, regardless of whether or not the quotations are typological, as we get into verses 27 through 29, where we're quoting Isaiah 10 about the northern kingdom and Isaiah 1 about the southern kingdom, here it is still the entire nation that is referred to as Israel, because the entire nation entered into the covenant pursuing a law of righteousness, but turning away from it, they failed to attain it. So what we then know, knowing that this is the entire nation being referred to as Israel, that the Gentiles are not Israel. As Paul took the quotation about the Assyrian exile and the survivors, and those who survived the Babylonian destruction, and he borrowed the language that applied to those people in that time and applied it to his day, he's also able, in verses 25 and 26, able to take language that refers to Israel, specifically in Hosea 2:23, with an end times fulfillment, because they are called not my people. He is able to take that and apply it to other people who are not God's people, because he has received the revelation of the Gentile inclusion. It is not saying that the context of Hosea 1 or Hosea 2 refers to the circumstances that Paul finds himself in, just like the quotation of Isaiah 10 and Isaiah 1 do not refer to the circumstances he finds himself in. Rather, he finds that these are typological. These are foreshadowing a greater fulfillment that is accomplished in Christ and realized in his day. So let's lay out the key points. Hosea 2:23 is the first quotation. In context, it absolutely does not deal with the events Paul is dealing with people coming or rejecting Christ. Hosea 1:10 is ambiguous. It could be referring to that, but not necessarily. And so we have to use the other text and their quotations to determine what's going on. So, point 2. Isaiah chapter 10, 22 and 23 is dealing with the survivors of the Assyrian exile, not coming to Christ in faith. And 3, Isaiah 1:9 is dealing with the survivors of the Babylonian destruction, also not dealing with the coming to Christ in faith. As a result of this, we know the references are typological, especially that last one. That last one is definitive. Paul goes on to speak of Gentiles and Israel, and Israel certainly includes all 12 tribes, because it is all 12 tribes who entered into the covenant agreement and pursued righteousness by the law, failing to obtain it. So the distinction here between Gentiles and Jews, Gentiles and Israel, is definitive. It is actual Gentiles. Gentiles means non-Israelites. It does not mean, as they claim, just nations. Nations is one meaning of the term that these are translated from, not the only meaning. So when they bring this passage to you, yeah, it's a little bit complex, and they're manipulating the text because they frankly don't know what's going on there. They haven't done the research. So you can bring this information to them, lay it out. Most likely they'll reject it, but if God works on them, works on their heart, they'll come to see the truth in time.